My name is BrantRosen, and I'm the Midwest Regional Director for the American Friends Service Committee, and I'm also a rabbi and have a congregation in Chicago, Tzedek, Chicago, which is it's a new congregation, about 4 years old, and founded on core values of social justice, and that's how I spend my time. I was asked by a local group here that's involved in doing Middle East peace advocacy to address the issue of anti-Semitism specifically, and both my understanding of what the history of anti-Semitism is, how it has been historically manifest, and how it's currently being manifest in the context of the Israel-Palestine issue. And really my overall message was, I had a few messages actually. One was that anti-Semitism is real, just like all forms of bigotry and racism are real, and continues to be a threat, just as all forms of intolerance against specific peoples are a threat. And also that the threat of anti-Semitism can be used for political purposes, and particularly by those who advocate for Israel, or even if we're talking about the government of Israel, can often use the very real threat of anti-Semitism in a cynical way in order to gain political advantage. And that's a very complicated issue that I think needs to be unpacked, but it's also very real, I believe. You know, Israel was founded in large part as a response to anti-Semitism. It was a European movement that sought to create a Jewish state in historic Palestine to address the issue of Jew hatred and attacks on Jews historically, particularly in Europe. And so anti-Semitism and the need to address anti-Semitism is really part of the DNA of Israel. At the same time, I believe that the establishment of the State of Israel was predicated on an injustice in as much as it dislocated a people who were living there. It dispossessed hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from their homes and created what is now the largest refugee problem in the world. And that is also real. And so often, in order to justify its actions, I believe, the government of Israel and Israel supporters will wield the threat of anti-Semitism and tar Palestinians and Arabs with the brush of anti-Semitism in order to gain their own political advantage, when the reality is much more complicated. There is a very real grievance by the Palestinians over how they were treated by Israel. At the same time, is there anti-Semitism among Palestinians in the Arab world? Yes, absolutely. But the question is, we need to understand that in context and not lump all Palestinians and all Arabs and all those who criticize the State of Israel together with anti-Semites writ large. The Holocaust and the memory of the Holocaust is also a very important piece of this. That Israel was founded in the wake of the Holocaust. And I think all people should be vigilant about making sure that these kinds of genocides never occur, ever, to Jews or anybody else. But to raise the prospect of, quote, another Holocaust, that Israel is the only buffer between Jews and another Holocaust, I think is also very problematic, and can often be cynically wielded in furtherance of support for Israel and justification for some of the very real human rights abuses that Israel is engaged in. My message is not that anti-Semitism is not a problem, but my message is that we need to address it where it's real, and not use it as a political tool for political purposes. So where is it real? I think it's very real in this country. I think what we saw in Charlottesville was a great example of that. It's real in some countries in Europe in terms of neo-Nazis and white nationalist politicians gaining political power in countries like Hungary and Poland, and even countries in Western Europe as well. Ironically, many of these countries have relationships with Israel. So I think one of the important things for us to be able to parse out is where is the real threat, and how do we marshal our resources toward addressing that threat. And I would argue that the way toward real security for all peoples who are being threatened because of who they are is through solidarity. It's through peoples finding common cause with one another, and standing up against white supremacists and powers that seek to shore up their power by oppressing minorities in their midst. That's why I find, as a Jew, I find common cause with Palestinians, because I think we have something very important in common, as we've both been historically persecuted because of who we are. Whether it's in this country or anywhere in the world, that when you have governments and you have power, there's usually very powerful individuals who benefit from that power and seek to shore it up. And often a time-honored tactic for doing that is by scapegoating minorities that are in their midst and blaming them for the problems, particularly in times of economic upheaval. I think we see that scapegoating of minorities and oppression of minorities occurs during times of economic insecurity. We saw that as a precursor to World War II, and I think we're seeing that the rise of far-right neo-fascist, neo-Nazi movements around the world. I'm not in any way trying to compare, as a complete parallel between now and prior to World War II, but I think in general we can see that in times of economic insecurity, governments, these kinds of totalitarian style governments tend to become emboldened, and it's often at the expense of vulnerable minorities in their midst. We certainly see that in this country in the Trump moment. There is a movement, a popular movement for justice for Palestine. Much of it is focused on the boycott, and divestment, and sanctions call that was put out by the Palestinian Civil Society, which is a nonviolent call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions of Israel until it complies with basic human rights. That is a movement that's growing. It's also under intense attack by the government of Israel and its supporters, but it's also attracting in the grassroots more and more adherents, particularly among young people. I think in general, for those who want to see justice done in the world in a time of increasing injustice, I'm a strong believer in popular movements. I think voting is important. I think political advocacy is important. But I think often we put a little bit too much faith in political leaders to do the right thing. And that I believe historically, if we look at all of the most important change, say in this country, it did not happen because politicians woke up one morning and decided to do the right thing. It was because popular movements were outside their door pushing them to do the right thing until it became untenable for them not to. So whether we're talking about the abolitionist movement of slavery, the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment didn't just pop out of thin air. It was a result of a huge popular movement for the abolition of slavery that was led in no small part by the people who were impacted the most, by slaves and former slaves. If you look at the civil rights movement, if you look at women's suffrage, if you look at any number of political advances in this country, it was always not because of politicians, but in spite of them. And so I would say that it's no different today, that if people are looking to become part of the solution to injustice, there are any number of popular movements that are springing up around the country and around the world that I think it would do well for us to become a part of, to learn about and become active in. What we're seeing is a backlash against these popular movements. So, as I mentioned before, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, particularly on college campuses, where much of that activity is happening, is a focus of that backlash. So we're seeing that happen in a number of ways, and part of it is on the political front. So we're seeing more and more state legislatures passing anti-BDS bills, and we're even seeing it happen on the federal level now. There's Congress is considering what they call the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act that will basically use a definition of anti-Semitism that is so vague that it could be construed that any criticism of Israel is considered anti-Semitic, which is hugely problematic, needless to say. And it's a difficult period right now because in Trump's administration, one of the men who is heading that charge, his name is Kenneth Marcus, was confirmed to be the head of the Civil Rights Committee of the Education Department, and he's made no secret of his desire to use that State Department definition of anti-Semitism to quash Palestine solidarity activism on college campuses, and to use Title IX protections to claim that Jewish students are being discriminated against because of criticism of Israel. So we're going to see more of that. He's already reopened a case at Rutgers University that was investigated by the previous administration under the Department of Education and was found to be baseless, and he's, true to form, has reopened it, and I think we're only going to see more of this. So, you know, I think these are incredibly troubling developments, but I also think in some way it's a sign of the success of the movement, because whenever you have whenever the powers that be are paying attention to you and engaging in backlash, that means they see you as a threat, you know, and that doesn't mean that means all the more that we need to double down on our efforts to fight against the efforts to criminalize free speech and to criminalize advocacy for the oppressed.
Yeah, I mean, you're taking anti-Semitism and using it as a weapon.
Right.
Weaponizing.
Right, we're using the threat, the cynical threat of anti-Semitism as a weapon. And one of the points I made last night was that the more attention our government spends on bogus claims of anti-Semitism, and we're putting the power of government behind this now, the more we are turning a blind eye to real anti-Semitism. And so we are seeing the rise of alt-right anti-Semites in this country. One of them, you know, Steve Bannon, for instance, was actually part of the government for a period. Trump is encouraging and emboldening these movements, and I think the more we focus on bogus claims of anti-Semitism and either turn a blind eye to or even embolden real anti-Semites, the more we're going to see the rise of, ironically enough, of very real, actual Jew hatred, along with other forms of racism as well. I see hope, going back to what I said earlier, in the popular movements that are being mobilized, and I see hope in the struggle. And you know, there's a lot of despair at the current political moment among those who have been struggling for justice, particularly those who have spent their lives doing it, because it feels like so many of the advances and accomplishments that we've made over history are being rolled back, and there's a feeling of despair of what was it all for. You know, an example would be, say, voting rights. You know, the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1964 as a result of incredible struggle and sacrifice, including many who gave their lives. And now we're seeing voting rights under serious attack all around the country. Voter suppression in many states, people taking completely off the voter rolls in Georgia and Indiana, all over the country. And there's a sense of despair that's like, what was all that sacrifice for? And what I would respond is that we need a new paradigm for understanding how struggle works. And struggle is not linear. It's not, it doesn't have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that's not to say there aren't important victories along their way. There are. But we need to be ever vigilant that we uphold those victories and build on them. Because the forces of injustice they're not vanquished. They tend to morph into different forms. Whether we're talking about voting rights, whether we're talking about, say, racism and Jim Crow is another great example. With the abolition of slavery, that didn't end the racist treatment of blacks in this country with the civil rights movement and the fall of Jim Crow. I mean, we look at the mass incarceration system in this country, we still see a huge inequitable caste system when it comes to black and white. So I think we need to get off of the mindset that the struggle is ever over. We need to understand that the struggle never ends. And that I find hope in the struggle itself. I find hope in finding common cause with others who share these values and who will show up for me and who I will show up for and who I will be accountable to. And you know, I see that within that struggle, we see the world that we're fighting for. We create that world for ourselves. And I think that's more important now than in any time in recent history in this country and around the world, and certainly in Israel-Palestine as well. Apropos of solidarity, in the Palestine solidarity movement, I did not want to create the impression that there is no anti-Semitism or that it's not a problem. And I think that all of us in this movement need to check one another. And so as a Jew who participates in this movement, I would ask my Christian colleagues and comrades who are part of this movement to be vigilant about anti-Semitism, whether it's done in an ignorant way or not. That is very real. So some of the examples of that. I asked last night if any of you ever hear someone in our movement talking about, quote unquote, the Jewish lobby. I would call them on that because the lobby for Israel is an Israel lobby. It's not simply a Jewish lobby. You know, when you call it a Jewish lobby, you are bringing up all kinds of tropes about Jews that have been used against Jews throughout history of being conspiratorial, of being power grabbing, of world domination. And the truth is, when you look at the lobby for Israel, the most powerful lobby for Israel is actually Christian. It's the Christian evangelical Zionist wing that is considerably more influential, more financially powerful, and has more adherents. There are at least 10 million Christian Zionists who are enormously influential in Washington. So if you hear things like the Jewish lobby, I would check folks and say, no, we're talking about the Israel lobby. Another example would be for those of us who consider Zionism to be a settler colonial enterprise, which I do. I think it is a colonial movement. I think the Zionist movement colonized Israel from bringing European Jews to create colonies in Israel, to create eventually a political Jewish state on the backs of the people who lived there. But if you hear, I would ask my comrades that if we are only condemning settler colonialism in Israel and we are remaining silent about it in this country, in terms of this country's legacy of settler colonialism, the fact that this country was founded on the backs of an indigenous people and that those people haven't gone away either, and in fact are probably the most oppressed minority in this country, if we don't make that connection, if we condemn settler colonialism in Israel and remain silent about it in this country, then shame on us as well. That's a double standard that I think is very problematic. And particularly because we are, as Americans, and those of us who are white Americans, we benefit enormously from the system of privilege that was created through colonization. So that's another example that I think part of solidarity means being able to check one another and remaining honest about our goals and our assumptions and about what it is that we're fighting for, and to make sure that we're not intentionally or not buying into troubling kinds of tropes that have been leveled at Jews in particular for a very, very long time.
Great point. Mm-hmm. Wow.
Yeah, I mean, the final piece on that subject that I mentioned was, because the audience last night was almost completely Christian, was that the struggle for justice in what Christians often call the Holy Land, it's important to keep in mind that injustice in the Holy Land did not start in 1948. That country has been racked by injustice for almost its entire history. That land, I should say. And for much of that history, it was by Christians, by Christian colonization, by Christian hegemony. The Crusades was a particularly ignoble period in the history of that part of the world. So I would check my Christian comrades to reckon with the legacy of their faith tradition vis-a-vis the Holy Land, just as much as I, as a Jew, am reckoning with the legacy of what's going on there now. And I have to say, I brought that up last night and was very encouraged by the response. We had a very good conversation about it, about the importance of seeing the big picture and not creating double standards around Zionism per se, but that to understand that Zionism, I believe, occurs within a larger context of injustice, and it's not about Jews alone. This work is what keeps me sane. There are certain people in the world, I guess my mom was like this, and I think I get this from her, that we're sort of pathologically empathetic, so that if there are people around us, either in our lives or just in the world, who are being treated badly, we take it very personally. And it's not always such a great thing. It's good to have a healthy boundary between yourself and the pain of the world. But for me, if I'm aware of this injustice, I don't get a good night's sleep. And for me, my therapy is through this struggle. If I just crawled back into bed and pulled the covers over my head, it would be even worse. So that's what keeps me from exploding, is to engage in this struggle with folks with whom I find common cause. And it's important, self-care is important for the long haul. It is easy to burn out on this work, and then you're no good to yourself or anyone else. For those who are engaged in the struggle, being able to regenerate your batteries is enormously important if you're going to do this work for the long haul.